Welcome to the Spaces Virtual Conference on the theme of Net Zero Carbon, Climate Emergency 2021. My name is Jenny Jackson. I'm a member of Spaces as a local government officer, currently Assistant Director for Planning and Transport Strategy working for the London boroughs of Richmond and Wandsworth, and I am your chair for this webinar. Before commencing with my introduction of our speaker today, I'd like to thank our 5 sponsors, Atkins, Faithful and Gould, IES, the MPS Group and Wilmot Dixon for their support. So this is the start of the second week of the virtual conference. All the webinars over the course of this 2-week period are being recorded and will be loaded to the Spaces YouTube channel. Delegates and Spaces members will be sent a link at the end of the conference. The recordings are only available to delegates and Spaces members. If you have any questions today for our speaker, please include them in the chat box and we will try and answer them towards the end of the session. So this afternoon's webinar is titled What Planning Can Do to Achieve Net Zero Carbon and will be presented by Victoria Hills. Victoria Hills is a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute and a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and in fact is the Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute with over 20 years in senior roles in planning, transport, organisational leadership and development. She latterly led the UK's largest regeneration project at Old Oak. Using the convening role of the Institute, Victoria makes the case for resourcing planning and advocating the important role of putting planning at the heart of government delivery for the quality places that people want to live in. She is driving forward delivery of the RTPI's corporate strategy for the 25,000 member strong Royal Town Planning Institute, focusing on raising the profile of planning, elevating the value of professionalism and promoting a diverse and inclusive profession to ensure genuine representation of the society in which we work. Victoria is also currently serving as a commissioner on the Essex Climate Action Commission and sits on the advisory group to the government's COVID-19 Recovery Commission. Victoria Hills, welcome. Thank you for supporting the Spaces 2021 conference and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you very much to Spaces, the sponsors, for having me here this afternoon live with you. We're hoping the network all holds out, fingers crossed, and that it doesn't melt in the heat, which is rather ironic that I'm speaking to you about climate action and global temperature changes on a day when we're probably having the hottest day of the year so far, where I'm based in northeast London, Essex borders. As you can see, I'm working from home today. Very much delighted to be here, and thank you for that great introduction. It is a topic that's close to my heart, as a planner, but also as the commissioner role you just heard about, and more recently I'm now chair of the Net Zero Innovation Network in for Essex County Council, which is a great opportunity to come together with people who are actually involved in delivering things that are going to be solutions, we hope. And in reflecting on what planning can do to achieve net zero carbon, I'll also be talking about it, but what it's doing now, but what perhaps it will do in the future, which is a hot topic in itself in the context of planning reform. But just to set some context and to get you all sort of thinking, blue sky thinking, literally blue sky here I'm looking to today, which is very lovely, is, the context, if you like, is that, many agreements on climate emergency, climate action have been signed globally before. We've had the global leaders of the G7 coming together in Cornwall, talking about many hot topics, but climate action, climate change is one that unites them all. One of the few things that does unite groups of leaders is this topic. And of course, we'll be looking forward to seeing perhaps even clearer action, escalated action on it in the run up to and during COP26, which happens in Glasgow later this year. And do look out for what we're involved at the RTPI on that, as we'll be hosting a fringe event, hopefully in person as well as hybrid up in Glasgow. But also just globally, the UN Habitat Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, you have to sort of remind yourself, if you're aware of them, they were set to be achieved by 2030. which used to seem a long way away. But as we sit here halfway through, unbelievably now, 2021, as we approach Midsummer's Day, the clock's ticking on those. And the time is now to turn sort of ambition and perhaps some rhetoric into reality, some really practical things. Because I think in the past, some may take the view that climate action, climate change is so big, either people were in denial that it was actually a thing, or lots of people found it too big to actually touch, feel and understand what they could do about it, and therefore it just didn't feel real. I think it's probably taken a global pandemic to realise that you can have big things that are bigger than one country or even one region or one continent, that you can actually touch and feel, and they can have a significant impact on your day-to-day life. And whether it's just a coincidence or not, my sense is that the pandemic has reawakened the public consciousness, if you like, on climate change, and that things beyond our control can actually start taking control of our daily lives. That's sort of point number one, I guess, relate to the pandemic. Point number two is the kind of enforced lockdowns and different ways of living our lives and living very locally, not being able to travel, in the extreme part of the lockdown, just being able to leave the house for exercise, has brought us so much closer to nature, biodiversity, wildlife over the course of the last 18 months than perhaps many of us were in touch with in our busy day-to-day lives. And that has given this reawakening of the seasons, the changes, but also what's going on out there in our local park or our window box or our forest, or the countryside, and a real appreciation for it and a real gratitude for it, that we want it to be around to enjoy. And so I think this is a really sweet spot of a topic, if you like, that genuinely there seems to be a real impetus behind delivering climate action at this moment in time, in a way that the stars haven't quite aligned with the kind of global leaders and the very local community, individuals wanting to do their bit and understand what they can practically do. And I think that's really where the planning side of it comes into certainly the future, but also some existing, and we'll talk about retrofit and I'll get onto that. But because planning, I often say, is the gateway to construction, with the exception of a very a minority amount of permitted development that's sort of prior consent stuff and just gets effectively a license to build or change something. Most things new build that you'll see, whether it's infrastructure, commercial, residential development, most of that needs a planning consent. And that's really an opportunity, not just to specify safety standards and how things are meant to look and feel, but also their functionality, if you like. And so it's about joining the dots on making sure you don't miss that opportunity, for example, to drive forward on net zero. And just to make that practical, how big an opportunity that is, it's currently the built environment contributes to about 40% of the UK's total carbon footprint. 40% of the built environment, and 18% of that 40 is on the buildings, existing building stock itself. So every time something new is built, whether it's a road, whether it's an underground line, whether it's a home, an extension, it's adding to the carbon footprint. And there are sayings, we're getting more familiar with them, like there's no such thing as sustainable as an old car. Now, whether or not you agree with that, these are the sorts of statements that you hear people saying, which is, well, how do we make something old more efficient first rather than scrap it and get something new? And that's really sort of perhaps where the retrofit side of things comes into it, which is also, a huge area for opportunity. Because if you look at homes, if you were to build 300,000 homes a year, which is the government's stated ambition, that still only represents 2% of existing building stock. So, of course, looking to the future and new standards associated with that is really, really important. But we cannot forget retrofit within all of that. However, I am going to be talking a lot about the future stuff. And so if you were going to build those 300,000 homes a year, each new home is about 50 tonnes of carbon just to build. That's not to operate it. And broadly speaking, 300,000 homes a year is about 15 million tonnes of CO2. If those homes are built in the existing, what were called unsustainable traditional construction methods. So driving forward modern methods is going to be really important. But I thought that was helpful in setting the context to just bring to life why the built environment is so important. And we have, a national context in England, but very similar contexts across the nations. And we work in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Ireland to build back better. They may not use the same jargon, but it's about COVID recovery. It's about new homes. There may be disagreements over the tenure, but at the same time, it's new homes, regardless of who owns them and who's built them. And so in ambitions also to level up and deliver growth and have a sustainable green recovery, there is an opportunity to ensure that we do not miss the opportunity to go net zero within all of that. So before I get on to, I guess, very practical ways, I may just reflect a little bit on as planners, where we start, our starting point on delivering on net zero is not necessarily the kit that's in the buildings or the look of the building. It's actually where the building goes. It's about the location of development. And this is something as an institute that we've done quite a bit of research on. Back in 2018, we did location of development research, which interestingly, the department don't do. So this is new data, which showed that still over half of new homes were being built more than 2 kilometres away from a transport hub, which is difficult then to promote sustainable travel because it relies on driving to somewhere to get a train, for example, rather than, not solely, you could get the bus, but you take the point, it's not an easy walk or cycle ride. It may be not as attractive to then think about using public transport for a journey that may otherwise be made by a car. Now, we're going to be repeating that research this year, and I'm really excited to see whether anything's changed, whether it's got better or whether it's got worse. We hope it's got better, but if it's got worse, it will be helpful for us as an institute to make the case, to make the policy levers stronger, to make sure you get the location of development correct, i.e. are we putting commercial development, the residential development and the infrastructure, is that going in the most sustainable location? And it's not just about proximity to public transport hubs, it's also about thinking about the things that need to go in that house, whether a house or building, energy or water. It's a bit more macro. Are they going in the right part of the country, for example, rather than the right part of the district? Because if we're having to construct new facilities to bring vast amounts, let's just say water, down to a different part of the country that doesn't have enough of it to service some new buildings, we do need to look at that in a broader sense to say, is that the most sustainable place to put that new development, for example? And also within the context of the location of development comes the design or the layout of that development. Is it permeable? Can people get around it by an option, with options, with a variety of ways of moving around, rather than just relying, for example, on motorised vehicles or electric vehicles? Is it easy to walk? Is it easy to cycle? And is it, is that access built in right from the get-go? And those things are difficult, or can be difficult. But having a really strong planning framework to set out the requirements, the ambitions for development, but also having a really proactive planning service to work alongside developers to push the boundaries and push them towards things that may not make sense per se for their individual development, but helps them knit into a broader piece. That does require resourcing, and it does require a strong national policy framework. And so what we've said as an institute, moving forward onto more the practical side of things, is we looked across the planning piece as to what's required for resourcing in local planning authority departments. Some of them have seen up to half of a hollowing out resourcing over the last 10 years. So we've got some really great research and figures on that, and we've just repeated that up in Scotland, and I'm afraid it's no better picture up there either. They've got a similar resourcing issue in Scotland. And so we put together a package of what we would need to deliver better planning, deliver the government's reform agenda for planning. And it came to gosh, if I'm having brain fog, it's because it's really hot here today. Apologies. It came to a figure, which I'll come back to in a moment, over 4 years. The important figure that I want to quote you within that was, we said one of the packages within our global ask was for every local authority to have a climate change or climate action planner. And that would be someone with a specialist climate action skills, but also that professional ability to weave in planning in a kind of a holistic way, whether it be into policy, whether it be into design, detailed decision making, and so on. And we said you would need 67 million to invest for every local authority in England to have a climate action planner for the next 4 years. And we think that's a really credible suggestion and a credible ask that would provide some real additionality to many local authorities across the country. And the reason that's even more relevant is last week, the MHCLG Communities and Local Government Select Committee, chaired by Clive Betts, published their report on their response to the government's proposals for planning reform. And we were delighted that they absolutely backed the RTPI calls for funding of the planning system over the next 4 years. They absolutely recognise the need for better resourcing and completely backed our call. So we do feel very practically, you can have lots of talk, you can have lots of policies, but you do actually need people on the ground who know the local area and who can really work to join those dots and work with people, investors, applicants, the community, the politicians, and really try and add some real life into those strategies or commissions, the like of which I'm just involved in with Essex County Council. So just a little focus on the planning reform aspect, if I may, and this is sort of more about what planning could do, if you like, or will do if it's fully enabled. We do recognise, there are a few hooks in the national planning policy framework, but they need to be even stronger to enable local planning authorities to really drive forward the delivery of net zero. And by that, I mean, it can't just be a nice to have or something that can be massaged out of a viability model if it doesn't stack up. Because if there generally is a climate crisis and a commitment to achieving net zero, then we can't really see new buildings coming forward that aren't delivering on that ambition, particularly in a consent now. If you think many of the things that are on build out now, particularly the larger sites, they may have had their consent 5 or even 10 years ago. But because the build out takes so long, the things that you might see popping up the ground now would appear to the consumer, potentially some of the aspects of it, to be sort of 10 years out of date. So we've really got to be advanced thinking now. And whether this relates to practicalities of heat pumps, energy, and sustainable urban drainage, that really needs to be baked into planning now, so that it's not seen as a nice to have. And we would have done it if we could, but I'm sorry we can't, because that means it just doesn't stack up. Well, we've got to be clever at finding ways to make things stack up. And so we do think there's a major opportunity for planning reform, particularly bearing in mind the planning bill is sort of aligning with when COP26 is sort of popping out. And there is a major opportunity here to showcase planning as being the driver of practical action within local authorities to deliver on net zero. And if you look at the powers that local authorities have, after the revenue raising powers of raising council tax and business rates, then the next biggest statutory power is planning. We know this to be true, that how much politicians value this power of planning and see it as an opportunity. Just imagine if it was even stronger and required areas to really step up on the delivery of net zero. I think there could be a real opportunity here. And just as by semi-coincidence, this morning we launched our inaugural Politicians in Planning Network. We want to encourage more politicians to be affiliate members of the RTPI, but also provide a network, an opportunity for politicians and planners to come together, debate, discuss, and also to provide better information to our politicians, hundreds of them, thousands of them working in planning across the UK, because we had speakers, politicians from Scotland, Wales, as well as England on the call today. And I'm delighted it was opened by Jackie Weaver, because, of course, she's done possibly more for elevating the significance of local involvement in decision making than perhaps many people have been able to over recent years. And incredibly grateful for Jackie's support on that. And I think there's a serious point here that you're only going to really drive forward this change in planning reform and drive forward net zero if everybody's involved in part of the conversation. And part of that is going to require some stronger hooks in the planning legislation for sure, as well as that resourcing that I talked about. But thinking practically, it's often very difficult beyond requiring things in individual consents for local authorities to have attraction at a slightly more significant level. And some of the broader issues that will drive forward net zero that relate to energy provision and infrastructure provision need to go beyond just a district council boundary, for example, and sometimes beyond a county council boundary. That's why as an institute, we've been promoting the idea of green growth boards, which would effectively see the bringing together of all of the agencies and organisations that are effectively involved in large spend programmes and policy in an area, and bringing them around the table and trying to get some alignment, some dots joining, but also some co-alignment of investments to deliver on net zero together. So if you've got, let's just take a county council that's got a huge spend programme on new schools, and you've got the NHS also spending on new hospitals, and you've got private investors and private companies also spending on their expansion programs, and you've got the Highways Agency involved in their side of investment in trying to get the roads ready for electric vehicles, for example, and you've got the rail companies, and you've got the local authorities, and you've got the universities, the colleges, and you bring them all together and try and get them all signed up to delivering on net zero at a city region level or a sub-regional level. We think this could be a really important practical way at seeing innovation drive forward kind of in an organic way rather than being too prescriptive, because I'm a strong believer that some of the best things happen because people got together and they innovated and they did it organically rather than being told, to sort of join the dots or being told to sort of plan by numbers, if you like, And so that's really part of the real practical example is the one that I'm involved in with the Net Zero Innovation Partnership, which is not a green growth board, but it's that, it's that concept of bringing people together. And, I always have a phrase, follow the money. Well, if people are investing and they want to invest in an area, then why not work with them to see how that broader investment could actually deliver broader goals, particularly if they work with people, new organisations they weren't thinking about working with before. And that's particularly important, for example, on procurement. If you're thinking about procuring green energy, it'd be a lot cheaper to go in and do it with others. And you might get a better deal, for example. So that dot joining. I've talked a little bit about integration of transport and land use. And that is actually where I started out my career as a transport planner. And one of the reasons I got into it was because transport back then was so disenfranchised from any land use planning. It's got a lot better. And in certain city region areas, it's an awful lot better, particularly where you have a statutory document, for example, in London, and then a statutory transport strategy that sits underneath it. But there's a lot further to go on that. But it is, of course, really, really important. And particularly in the context of technology, where that seems to be overtaking the planning context. And, if you want a great example of that, just look at the e-scooter trials that are happening now across England. And that's called catching up with the tech, or perhaps rather cruelly being caught napping at the wheel while something else was happening and we didn't have an approach to plan for it. They were already there. And anyone who's been cycling in London, for example, will know that they've been around for a long time anyway. So the trial is sort of, we've been having a human laboratory trial for the last year, and now we're having the proper trial, if you like. I've mentioned about resourcing for local planning authorities, but I also want to talk about empowering local planning authorities. And one of the things sort of tied up with the Green Growth Board is something we've been looking at, which is sort of local environmental management plans, if you like. And at the moment, we've got sort of lots of statutory agencies, particularly, the Environment Agency, involved in lots of very kind of clunky things at a national level. What we'd like to see is some of that devolved a little bit more to areas, so that they could be much more in the driving seat of, for example, local coastal management plans or flood resilience, rather than that coming, very, very centrally. And we think there's an opportunity here, if you empower local authorities, that they can drive in the delivery of net zero in that, and they're well placed. They know their local areas. I guess upskilling local authorities is not one thing just having money, but it's actually making sure we've got the right skills to deliver on net zero as well. We published our local authority guide for planners jointly with the Town and Country Planning Association on how to deliver on climate change. There's some very practical things there. And last September, we published our climate tools portal, which provides, I think, 18 different climate management mitigation tools in one place for planners to draw upon, and we'll keep adding to that. One area I haven't perhaps talked about so much is plan tech and digital and data. I think delivering on climate action is going to achieving net zero could be fast tracked even further if we had better planning data as a kind of underpinning anything that may come out of it, and driving real-time data in particular, because it's difficult to see and monitor how we're actually delivering on any of this if we don't have a better grasp of that data. Now, one example you may have come across, and if you haven't, it's well worth a look, is the London Data Hub. They've done what I think is unique in the UK, certainly, is pull together all 33 local authority planning data into one place, into a live stream feed with dashboards galore, and it's open source. It's a significant investment that the Greater London Authority have made, and it basically means they get all of the planning data direct feed into one place, into the London Data Hub. And when you've got access to that data, you can monitor what's going on easily, where the developer's going, what type of development, and a whole heap more. And I think investment in that sort of open source data nationally is not only going to be really, really important for delivering on digital planning, but it's going to be as equally important for delivering on net zero, because only if you've got open source data can you actually see what on earth is going on. And off the back of that, you can then have the innovation that I alluded to through people who are far cleverer at innovating with data than perhaps planners are. I know planners, some of you hopefully are our members listening, I know you're all very clever people, but actually leaving the data manipulation to people who specialise in that to do great things with it surely would be very helpful for all of us. And putting that very practically, an example I'll draw upon is one that relates to an earlier job of mine when I was working for the Mayor of London. I was the head of transport a few years back, and TfL had a commercial decision to take. Did they make their all of their travel data commercially available, or did they make it open source. And they took a decision back then, or rather the mayor did, the then mayor, to say, actually, we'll concentrate on running the transport system. We'll put all of the transport, travel, live feed data into open source. And what that caused was an absolute explosion of innovation in apps about how people traveled, making people's life easier and all the rest of it. So just think what we may be able to achieve off open source planning data, particularly in the context of net zero. So that's my sell on that, just in case the minister's listening. I have made this point to Minister Pincher. Yes, it's great that lots of people are doing widgets and digits of plan tech tools, but really you've got to have the underpin actual data first to build up on, and that would be my plea. So I'm going to sort of pull this a little bit into a summary of what I think the key areas of the key ingredients will be for success in delivering on net zero. And when I first came into this job, just over 3 years ago now, some said, well, it's a bit of a curious move. You've come out of a project, you've come out of delivery. Why are you running the professional body? Well, actually, it's not just about running a charity. It is about campaigning and influencing and driving forward the agenda of many of these really important topics that I've touched on today. Hence why I'm here talking to you today. It is that partly that advocacy role as well. And I was reflecting on, what is it about successful places? What do they have? What are the core components where great things can happen? And I think this example that I'll just run through with you now is as relevant for what will it be? What places will be the places that are successful in delivering on net zero? Which are the ones that are going to be the market leaders, if you like, that they declared the climate emergency, but then they actually got round to delivering an implementation plan, on the ground delivery. They were able to demonstrate what they were actually delivering and how they were having a positive impact on reaching net zero. And there are 5 components, which I'm just going to run through. And these are in no particular order, but the first one, well, the first 2 are leadership, but the first one is political leadership. You have to have a champion, someone locally who really is actually sort of selling themselves that they want to deliver on net zero. And that's got to be a political champion ultimately, because they've got to be elected, they've got to be accountable to the local population, whether that's a mayor, whether it's a leader of a council, a leader of a county council, a district leader, but it needs to be that champion who, ultimately you would say, well, that should be the Prime Minister. And some may say it was over the weekend at G7, but that person is genuinely saying we're going to deliver on net zero. The small L leader is the executive leader. And we are a big advocate of chief planning officers, someone who is holding the ring in a local authority, joining the dots, but banging heads together, spotting the opportunities, and working through some of the more knottier issues that see many schemes, for example, fall over or an opportunity missed. And in Scotland, where we were working with the government there on planning reform or the planning bill, we were able to get that every local authority should have a chief planning officer in statute. And we're going to be pushing that through planning reform here, because it's really, really important that, yes, you have the advocate who's political, but you've got to have someone at a strategic top table level who has the respect of the chief executive or the ear of the chief executive in the local authority, who can have an impact on policy, but also, most importantly, on budgets, because that leads me to the third component, which is the team. Who is actually going to do the day-to-day delivery on net zero? And yes, there will be private sector, we'll come on to that, but you do actually need people whose job it is to deliver on net zero locally. And I made the case earlier for every local authority to have a climate change or climate action planner or net zero planner. But if you've got that chief planning officer who can ensure they are there sat alongside their chief finance officer, making the case for a well-resourced planning department, which won't be easy, because we know where many local authorities are, and sadly more will follow in terms of real acute issues. But the point is funding issues. But the point is, if you have that investment in placemaking, it does help to get the costs down in some of these other areas where people are not having access to employment, they've got poor health. It's about joining the dots over a generation. And that's why it's really important to have a strong place leader So we're delighted that it's there as a chief placemaker in the planning white paper, but we think that chief placemaker should be a chief planner, of course. And so actually that dovetailed in with 4, the team and the resourcing. So really the 5th component, which is possibly the most important of all, is the community. Delivering on net zero, you can have the politicians, you can have the leading executive saying lots of good things, you can have well-funded department, you can have the team there, but if you haven't got the community with you, it's going to be really difficult. And by community, I'm not just talking about the local residents associations, as important as they are. I'm talking about the whole community, the investment community, the working community, the resident community, the education community, the whole lot. And that is really important because A, they've got to want to be part of it. But B, if you're encouraging people to spend money and innovate and make investments and commitments, financial commitments in an area, they've got to recognise that this is a place where A, they're going to be welcome, and B, it is going to make a return for them over the longer term, because that commitment at the leadership level is there. So I think that probably takes us, I guess, neatly back to the start in some respects, that we have never had such an opportunity, I think, with global leaders signing up to the need for urgent climate action. Is much more significant than it would have been 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. But also an opportunity here, the public reawakening, the consciousness, the urgency to want to do something. And how can I help? That's where the practical planning side of it comes into it. So, some of the things that we'll be driving forward, and you'll see many local authorities driving forward, is very practically any new school that's been commissioned shouldn't be commissioned unless it's net zero. Any new home, any new commercial property, retrofitting existing stock, hospitals, schools, all of that is going to be so big. But if we don't do it, we're not going to deliver on net zero. So putting those components together, taking the context we now find ourselves in, a once in a lifetime shock, if you like, and we all hope this pandemic is once in our lifetime shock, to the system, which has been a wake-up call to the need to re-engage with our ecosystem, our environment. We've reconnected with nature. We recognise what's going on in global warming. We're much more cognizant of what's going on around us than we were when we were wrapped up in a daily hustle of pre-pandemic ways. Let's take this opportunity. Let's take the opportunity of the planning bill to strengthen up the legislative hooks. Let's keep making the case for resourcing, and let's look to a future where I think planning has got a really key role to play in delivering on net zero. But thank you very much for listening. That takes me to about 35 minutes. So I talked longer than I thought, but I was in a bit of a flow there. So I'm going to hand back to you now, Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. That was really interesting how you wove all of the relevant pieces together. And I have to say, you've raised a lot of questions in my mind as well. I'm just going to start with one of them before I look at the questions in the chat box. So in the context of the pandemic and town centres, economic recovery in town centres and living locally, as you spoke, what's your view on the importance of retaining mixed uses in town centres?
Yes, I think this is something that I feel very passionate about, and I think probably a lot of people do, particularly as we were living in a lockdown and perhaps we were walking to our local high street or shop or town centre. And I don't know about you, but I certainly felt very grateful that it was there, because it's A, I could get my exercise in the short lunch break, but B, I could actually get something I needed rather than just ordering it. And that made me feel quite good, actually, because whilst I would admit, being able to order stuff and see it turn up is very helpful. Particularly when you've got busy work life, family life, and all the rest of it. And there was something quite nice about being able to walk up the road and go and buy some food or get to the post office and post something back. And we think that the pandemic provides this opportunity for a bit of a renaissance in town centres and city centres if it's planned correctly. And by that, that means not an over-dominance of one particular use. So we're not against residential in city centres, town centres. In fact, we're very pro it. You know, it's a great opportunity to breathe some life back in, but not at the expense of some of the uses that we already have. And one of the things we've seen sort of snuck through in advance of the planning reform is a change to permitted development rights and a new class. I don't want to get all techie on you here, but a new, you will know it, Jenny, but a new class of use called Class E, which is a catch-all for everything. It covers gyms, creches, post offices, shops, you know, it's all kind of lumped in there. And we've seen a permitted development rights statutory instrument come through recently, which we were very against, because it enables permit development to residential from this use. And we're worried that many landlords who have lost an awful lot of rent because companies have been on furlough, they've been closed, when this gets enacted in August, will say, brilliant, that's it, we'll change to residential, because why wouldn't we? With the exception of a few very, very successful places. You know, for example, let's just take Cheltenham High Street. You know, retail is very buoyant there. It's unlikely you would change all of that into residential, but we're worried that some of these changes could see, you know, understandably, landlords who may be on their knees themselves with debt, having to recoup some losses. And residential, currently, if you're playing a game of top trumps, residential, generally speaking, favours commercial land use every time, with the exception of possibly Park Royal in West London and some very high value distribution parks up on the M1. With the exception of that, you know, so it is a concern for us, because how are you going to deliver on net zero if you haven't got walkable neighbourhoods and places people can walk and cycle to? Because it either means you've got to drive somewhere to get shopping, or to get to the doctors, or to get to your creche or your gym, or it means you're going to have to order it in. And both of those are not the sustainable first choice, if you like, from a net zero perspective. First choice should always be, I can get to it locally. So it's one we're going to be keeping a very, very close eye on. And we will be holding the government's feet to the fire on it.
I think it's fair to say that there are a number of local authorities across the country whose politicians have asked about those permitted development rights and, you know, what they can do for exactly the same reasons that you've described. You know, we all accept that we need a mix of uses in town centres, but we don't suddenly want to find key shopping frontages in our high streets suddenly converted to residential uses. Okay, so there's a really interesting question from Greg. Thank you, Greg, in the chat. I think this is a great question. So, Victoria, if you could address world leaders at COP26, what would be your one key message?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because we did put together a fantastic proposal for the green zone, but it didn't get taken up. They were absolutely inundated. So what my message would be, and it wouldn't be me giving it, it'd be my president, and she would be stood alongside the presidents of our closest institutes, the American Planning Institute, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada. We stand shoulder to shoulder with them on this. And we would say collectively that you can only deliver net zero practically through new development with a well-resourced, well-structured planning system that has the appropriate policy requirements to require new development to meet net zero. So try and keeping it very simple, hooks and money. That's what we'd be saying. And it's hard to see how else you can get new development in the built environment to do it other than through planning, because it all requires a consent, with the exception of those small permitted developments, things I talked about.
Thank you. I really like the way that you pulled that together. I think another question. Go on.
Just incidentally, we are going to run that as a fringe, by the way. I'm not really meant to announce this now, but we are going to run this as a fringe event in Glasgow anyway. And hopefully either in person or hybrid, those presidents will be with us because we belong to something called the Global Planners Network. And it is genuinely a thing that I meet regularly with the chief executives, and the presidents meet regularly to talk about working together.
And if any of you follow Victoria on LinkedIn, or if you don't, I would encourage you to follow Victoria on LinkedIn, and you can see some of those announcements from the various institutes, as you said, across the world that we are very much engaged in through the RTPI. Another question for you, it links a little to what you've just said. You made me reach for my copy of the National Planning Policy Framework while you were talking, just because I thought, oh, I wonder where climate change features in the chapters in the National Planning Policy Framework, for those of you listening who don't know the government's policy for planning. And it's chapter 14, which I think is a bit disappointing, and housing, not surprisingly, comes in at chapter 5. So maybe says something about where the government's head is.
Well, I think the fact it's in there, though, is an improvement of an earlier iteration. So we are you're thankful it's progress. But I completely agree, and this is why the planning bills can be really important, because I think it's got to be reframed. That this isn't just about numbers and housing. This is about delivering on net zero, and planning is more than just homes. I know it's hard to remember that time, but it's more to planning than just new homes. So, yes. Absolutely.
But I think the question is in that context of your sort of joining the dots, which I think is an important role of a chief planner in local authority. Through building control, government's obviously been consulting on the future homes standard. Do you think that would meet the challenge that you're setting of achieving targets for new build homes, or do you think it perhaps could go a little bit further?
I think it's a very, very hot topic, this one, previous announcements have been made. Some are, some people were disappointed that things were said and then taken out of statements, and it's very confusing. And actually, the serious point here is to provide incentives to anybody, for example, in the business of building homes. You've got to have certainty. I sit round the Future Homes Task Force convened by the National Homes Federation, not housing anymore, Homes Federation. And I sit around that table virtually over the last year with, some of the major house builders and mid-sized house builders. They can deliver and do their bit on delivering on net zero if they know what's coming down the line. Many of them will say, well, if you want to get rid of boilers by 2025, that is actually not possible because of the pipeline, if you're part of what they've got coming through at the moment, and the manufacturers of what the alternative is. So we're going to need a bit more of a heads up than that. So I think that I'm paraphrasing a bit here for speed, but there is a really important point that we all must hold the government's feet to the fire to get this standard right this year, in the year of COP26 coming to the UK, that we can't keep sort of stringing people along with this is what we want to do, but actually we're not quite sure exactly which bit is going where and how, and so the certainty point is really really important in that future home standard. I think, to answer your question, it absolutely can play a really important role, but it is going to require some real courage from the government to push the boundary. We've heard courage at a global level at G7, but pardon the pun, the devil's in the detail here, and some of the analysis I've seen coming out wasn't very much new. Well, okay, they've done their big meeting now. COP26 has got to be the focus for that detail.
Thank you, Victoria. As you said, that political leadership is one of your 5 key ingredients. I think the other question that sprang to my mind, if you don't mind me asking a question, you talked about retrofitting. I wondered whether you had a view on the challenge of retrofitting in conservation areas and on listed buildings, because in Richmond we have been running something around our climate action plan around the Green Homes grants, and we've been looking at how best to assist residents where actually they will need planning permission for what they're proposing because they're sited in a conservation area, and they need to put panels on front elevations of buildings. I don't know whether you have a view on that particular challenge.
Well, it's one of the challenges within retrofit. Just taking a step back, the bigger challenge in retrofit is that it's still cheaper for tax reasons to knock a building down than it is to retrofit it for new build. And that's a bigger campaign issue. If anyone's interested in that particular issue, just look up AJ, Architects Journal. Their editor, Will Hurst, is leading that campaign nationally now. And we're a supporter to that campaign, which is we've got to end the perversity of it being cheaper to knock old stuff down and rebuild it. And it has happened on my own patch in my previous job in Old Oak, where we were looking at nice buildings that weren't listed and they weren't in a conservation area. And, you know, talk of a development corporation, talk of a, you know, we're putting a line around this area, this is a new local plan area. Lo and behold, something, you know, that didn't require permission to get knocked down was cleared, you know, before we'd even got started. And that's a real shame, just from a heritage point of view, let alone carbon.
Yes.
Specifically on the buildings you're talking about, they are protected. So that's a good thing, because actually in the new planning system, there are 3 areas proposed, and one of them is protect. And these are the areas. And actually, one of the things that, you know, my colleagues have been reflected on is, thank goodness we've got a robust planning system in place, because we've all been forced to have staycations, okay, and we're enjoying all these parts of the UK and going out and seeing all these beautiful places that are preserved for history and heritage. And actually, colleagues, it comes a bit like this nature, you know, reawakening of our recognition of nature. It's also been a bit of a reignition of our recognition of heritage and our cultural heritage. Some of it for bad reasons. I'm not going into statues. That's definitely not what I'm going into today. But actually recognising, wow, what beautiful buildings we have. And that is one of the great success stories of the planning system that we don't talk about. Now, in terms of the challenges associated with retrofitting, you know, I'm of the view that challenge provides an innovation opportunity, a business opportunity for architects, for designers of M&E equipment to come up with innovative solutions that can be designed in a really great way, that can be delivered rather than just bolting on something ugly onto a building. So I think it's about how we work with that innovation. Yeah. And that's why things like innovation networks and green growth boards are really important, because if you can convince the inventors there's a business here, there's a really big business here, they can come up with beautiful things. I'm quite convinced of it. But the people who are probably designing that kit at the moment perhaps aren't thinking in that way. And so my challenge, this is about getting the right people around the building and showing that there is a massive market here for this, not just in the UK, but globally. And we could export all of this as well, obviously in a sustainable way on the ship, not flying it around, but yes.
Indeed.
Anyway,
I think time for one last question. Government and their agencies obviously support many infrastructure projects. Do you think that they should require a climate change consideration? So, for example, you know, should Homes England only support climate zero homes? Is this a change we could make now?
I think anybody spending public money, taxpayers' money, should be delivering on net zero by a certain time. Now, you can't immediately say, right, as of tomorrow, anything that Homes England procures must be to net zero standards, because that's impractical for the reasons I've said. What you could set out is a trajectory, and excuse me, Homes England, if you're listening, I haven't looked at your strategic plan, and you may have it in there to say that by 2025, no new home will be commissioned that does not deliver on net zero standards. And absolutely, if they're not doing that already, they absolutely should be. And I would also weave into that public infrastructure. And I know, for example, if you take the biggest infrastructure project at the moment, possibly, HS2, they are they doing enough on that? I don't know. I don't know, but they shouldn't, you know, absolutely be striving to deliver on net zero. So yes, they should be, and that's some of the hooks I think I was alluding to that are required to be strengthened up at the national policy level, because they're too big of things just to leave to local politicians to sort out. Got nothing against local politicians, but you do need to have some real oomph behind it by those national requirements.
Thank you, Victoria. I think we have come to the end of our hour almost. I'd like to thank those who've attended the webinar. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our presenter, Victoria Hills, Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute, and also our sponsors, Atkins, Faithful and Gould, IES, the MPS Group and Wilmot Dixon for their support. If I could ask those attending to take a few seconds to answer the feedback question on the screen, which is on a scale of 1, which is poor, to 5, excellent. How would you rate this webinar? Thank you. And just a reminder that all the webinars over the 2-week period are being recorded and will be loaded to the Spaces YouTube channel. I know there's a number of other webinars running this week. Take a look at the Spaces website for the full virtual conference programme. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.